Arterial hypertension, also known as high blood pressure, is a clinical condition characterized by high blood pressure in the arteries, whose values at rest are higher than normal ones. According to the World Health Organization guidelines, we talk about hypertension when the diastolic pressure, or minimum pressure, exceeds 90 millimeters of mercury and the systolic pressure, or maximum pressure, exceeds 140 millimeters of mercury. Arterial hypertension is one of the most widespread disorders in industrialized countries and affects approximately 20% of the adult population. It is not a disease in itself, but a risk factor that increases the likelihood of being affected by a stroke, myocardial infarction, kidney failure, and other cardio-cerebrovascular diseases. In the latest videos, which you can find by clicking above, we have seen what needs to be done to lower blood pressure naturally and what are some foods capable of lowering it. In this video, however, we will see what are some foods that raise blood pressure. Salt. Sodium is an essential mineral for the proper functioning of our organism, as it regulates the quantity of water present between tissue cells and in the blood, participates in the transmission of nerve impulses, and guarantees muscle contraction. The World Health Organization recommends a maximum salt consumption of 5 grams per day for adults. This is because numerous studies have now shown that excessive sodium consumption causes a significant increase in blood pressure and has been linked to the onset of hypertension and its cardiovascular complications. It causes inflammation of the microvascular endothelium, increases systemic peripheral resistance, and alters the structure of the arteries, making them stiffer and less elastic. The sodium intake in our daily diet is not only represented by the table salt that we add to season our dishes, but also by that present in industrial products. Based on the eating habits of Italians, the main sources of salt are bread, cured meats, and cheeses. Bread and baked products, such as crackers, breadsticks, focaccia, and to a lesser extent, biscuits, snacks, and breakfast cereals, are all foods that belong to the so-called hidden sources of sodium, as they contain more sodium than we think. In fact, they are consumed every day and in higher quantities than other foods, so it is necessary to moderate their consumption in order not to raise blood pressure values. Among the cured meats that contain a greater quantity of salt, we find raw ham, speck, and salami, while among the cheeses, we find pecorino, feta, taleggio, and provolone. Also pay attention to the condiments used in the kitchen to replace or in addition to salt, such as stock cubes, soy sauce, ketchup, mayonnaise, and mustard, but also all those salty snacks such as peanuts, chips, and popcorn, as well as pickles and some sauces and ready-made foods. Saturated fats and trans fats. Saturated fats are fatty acids present in numerous foods, for example in the fatty parts of meat and derivatives, in butter and fatty cheeses, in fried foods and cured meats, such as sausage and wurstel, but also in some vegetable oils, such as coconut oil and palm oil. Following some studies, it was discovered that a diet high in saturated fats is associated with higher levels of systolic and diastolic blood pressure, as it increases the levels of the angiotensin-converting enzyme. It is an enzyme produced by the endothelial cells of the blood vessels of all organs, but in particular the lung. It intervenes in the regulation of an important hormonal mechanism called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which has the task of regulating blood pressure, circulating plasma volume, and arterial muscle tone. Excessive consumption of saturated fats also increases the levels of triglycerides and cholesterol in the blood, especially the bad cholesterol, an important risk factor for the onset of cardiovascular diseases and hypertension. It is also important to limit the consumption of trans fats as much as possible. Unsaturated fatty acids, which are found mainly in industrial products, for example in spreadable creams and snacks, but also in fast food products, cakes, and packaged biscuits. Sugar. According to the result of some epidemiological studies and experimental studies, not only salt but also a high intake of added sugars can increase blood pressure values, heart rate, myocardial oxygen demand, and contribute to inflammation, resistance to insulin, and an increased risk of developing cardiometabolic diseases. Sugars are able to increase levels of uric acid, the final product of protein metabolism, which in turn inhibits the release of endothelial nitric oxide, an important endogenous mediator of some biological processes, such as vasodilation and the transmission of nerve impulses. A high consumption of added sugars, therefore, causes a decrease in nitric oxide levels in the body and causes a narrowing of blood vessels and consequently an increase in blood pressure. The term added sugars refers to all those refined sugars that are added to packaged foods during the industrial production process in order to give them a more pleasant flavor and ensure longer storage times. Among the main sources of added sugars, we find products from the confectionery industry, such as cakes, biscuits, ice cream, snacks, and candies, but also bread, jams, yogurts, some frozen foods, and ready-made sauces. Syrups, carbonated drinks, fruit juices, alcohol, and spirits are all important sources of added sugars, whose consumption should be limited as much as possible. World Health Organization guidelines recommend reducing daily intake of free sugars to less than 10% of your total energy intake. A further reduction to below 5%, or around 25 grams, equivalent to 6 teaspoons per day, would provide additional health benefits. Alcohol. Alcoholic drinks, whether it is a glass of wine, a glass of beer, or a spirit, all contain ethyl alcohol, also called ethanol. Drinks that provide empty calories, that is, they do not provide useful nutrients to the body or its functions. Excessive alcohol consumption is considered one of the most common causes of increased blood pressure and heart rate in both men and women. There are several possible mechanisms through which alcohol can increase blood pressure, and among these, we find an increase in the activity of the sympathetic nervous system, most likely linked to the secretion of corticotropin-releasing hormone. It is a hormone produced by the hypothalamus and stimulated by alcohol intake, which causes an increase in plasma cortisol levels and therefore an increase in blood pressure. Among the other possible mechanisms by which alcohol causes hypertension, we find endothelial dysfunction, vasoconstriction, impairment of baroreceptors, neurosensory receptors sensitive to pressure variations in the cardiovascular system, and finally, the activation of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. Excessive alcohol consumption therefore increases blood pressure values, as well as promoting an increase in triglyceride levels in the blood, which in turn leads to hypertension and cardiovascular damage. It is therefore important to keep blood pressure under control and keep it as close as possible to the values established by international guidelines, that is 80 millimeters of mercury for the minimum pressure and 120 millimeters of mercury for the maximum one.